Hi, and welcome to another episode of Dashy Notes. Today we'll be talking about the Bennet sisters and their mother. How many times do we hear Mrs. Bennet shrieking, "Mr. Bennet, my poor nerves!" Whatever happened to her nerves? Oh, probably lots of things, but foremost on her mind is the fact that she has 5 single daughters that she needs to marry off before her husband dies and they all live up living on charity. But have you ever wondered, why are the Bennet sisters so poor? What makes them so unmarriable? And also, what does any of this have to do with Mr. Collins? Those are great questions and we'll be answering them for you here today on Dashy Notes. My name is Ellie Dashwood and this is where we answer your modern day questions about classic literature. So why are the Bennet sisters so poor? Well, put simply, because they have incredibly small dowries. Now, you may be familiar with the term dowry from watching episode 1 of Dashy Notes, where we went over Regency Economics 101. A dowry is essentially the small fortune that a lady brings to her husband upon marriage, and this really affected both her social standing, who she could marry, and even her possibility of life as an old maid. Now, just to sort of break this down more and help us to better understand it, we'll be going over 3 main questions today. First is, where did the money for a dowry come from? The second is, how does a dowry affect marriage? And the third is, how does a dowry affect the possibility and then the livelihood of being an old maid? First, where does a dowry come from? Dowries were essentially the college saving funds a family had for a girl at the time, only instead of saving up for college when she gets older, they're saving up for her future marriage. Now, they got the money for these funds in 3 basic ways. The first is through the mother's dowry. Now, a mother in Regency England had her own dowry all those years ago when she got married. And as we learned in episode 1 of Dashy Notes, more than likely this money was then put into a bank account where they lived off the investment over these years. However, a mother's dowry also served as the basis for her daughter's future dowries. After she died, it would be divided up among her daughters, and this would help them start their own small fortunes. We see an example of this in Pride and Prejudice because that's where Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters got their dowry. Mrs. Bennet brought £5,000 into her marriage. That £5,000 is now divided among her 5 daughters. So each of them has £1,000. But that's an incredibly small dowry. 2 is the family estate. Now, if the father wanted to add more money to his daughter's dowry, he could break up his estate, such as selling a field or giving a piece of land to his daughter. However, this was not a very popular option because not only did it break up the family legacy, it also interfered with the oldest son's inheritance. And also, in many aspects, it was not even possible because the estate was protected by an entailment, which was what was happening in Pride and Prejudice. 3. Saving. Now, this was one of the best methods for creating a dowry for your daughter, and it was most like a college saving fund in that the family put something aside every year so that when the daughter came of age, she would have a small fortune to bring to her marriage. However, this also took planning, foresight, just like today with saving. And we see in several of the novels, this just wasn't possible. Mr. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice regrets that he never thought ahead to saving for his daughters. And in Sense and Sensibility, Eleanor's, Marianne's, and Margaret's father had planned on saving once he inherited Norland Park, but right after he inherited Norland Park, guess what happened? He died and never had a chance to save money for them. 2. How did dowries affect marriage? Well, it all goes back to money. Men at this time wanted to marry rich girls because being genteel meant not having a job, and not having a job meant needing to find other ways to get money, and a great way to do that if you were a man would be to marry a girl with a large fortune. So that's why the more money a girl had in her fortune, the more likely she was to get married because it would attract the suitors. So how much money would be required to attract those dashing suitors? Well, let's look at a couple of examples from Jane Austen's book. Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice has one of the smallest dowries at only £1,000, which was not very much at all during that time period, and it's exactly why Mr. Collins doesn't really believe her when she turns him down. He's like, you're poor, nobody else is gonna want to marry you, and she's still like, whatever. On average though, in Jane Austen novels, a lot of the girls have between 3,000 and 4,000 pounds, which wasn't a lot, but it was decent. We see that the Dashwood sisters in Sense and Sensibility have that much, as does Anne Elliot in Persuasion and Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey. Mrs. Elton in Emma has about 10,000 pounds, which is a good range for a dowry. Next up we have Miss Crawford, who has 20,000 pounds in Mansfield Park, which is great for attracting a husband. And of course you have the very rich heiresses of Emma Woodhouse and Georgiana Darcy, who both have 30,000 apiece. And that's how you attract the Wickhams of the world, apparently. The greatest dowry mentioned in Jane Austen's novels is in Sense and Sensibility and belongs to Miss Grey, whose 50,000 pounds attract Mr. Willoughby. If you want to attract Mr. Willoughby, that is. 3. How does a dowry affect being an old maid? Well, as we've already talked about, having a large dowry already prevents you from being an old maid. However, not everybody is so lucky. In modern terms, the idea of a woman staying single is quite commonplace, but at the time girls wanted to avoid that like the plague because the marriage was the #1 way to support yourself. Otherwise, old maids, who were often very poor, ended up living off the charity of their relatives, which is exactly what would have happened to the Bennet sisters had Darcy and Bingley not showed up. However, if you were lucky enough to be an old maid with a large fortune, you could deposit that in the bank like we learned about in episode 1 of Dashy Notes and live off the interest. In fact, Emma Woodhouse in Emma says that she plans on being an old maid because she has such a large fortune, she knows that she will be rich no matter what she does. In conclusion, why are the Bennet sisters so poor? And the answer is they have very small fortunes. At only 1,000 pounds apiece, they do not have much to attract a husband with, nor support themselves if they become an old maid. However, Bingley and Darcy don't care about that and fall in love with Elizabeth and Jane anyway. It's definitely going to help their mother's nerves. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this has been another episode of Dashy Notes. I hope you enjoyed having a modern day question about classic literature be answered. Please subscribe to my channel for more videos, and have an awesome day.